Hey everybody, and welcome back to Sweatpants BI. This is part 2 of our full-length HR report walkthrough. And in this video, we're going to do a little bit of DAX. We're going to focus specifically on how to calculate our 3 most important measures and the various sub-measures that we're going to need to get at those calculations, namely employee headcount, employee retention, and employee turnover. So if you are someone who is building HR reports, and if you ever have wondered how you calculate something like retention in particular in Power BI, this is definitely a video for you. I'm going to walk you through some various DAX techniques for building a retention calculation that's going to be flexible for almost any time period over which you could calculate employee retention. Headcount, turnover, those are a little bit more straightforward, but employee retention in particular is something that we're going to be talking about pretty heavily in this video so that we can build some really cool views with all 3 of these measures in the subsequent videos in this series. So let's jump back into Power BI and let's flex our DAX muscle a little bit. Now, the first measure that we're going to calculate is going to be a head count measure. And in order to perform many of the calculations that we're going to need, since they're all going to be very time sensitive, for example, tracking the number of employees by year in this data set and tracking when employees are being hired or leaving the company over time, we're obviously going to need some kind of temporal component in our data model. And that might sound fancy, but really I'm just talking about a date table. So if we look over here in our data set, of course, most of our dates are in this people fact table, if not all of our dates. And we have 2 primary columns that we're interested in, our hire date and our term date, or the date when employees are leaving the company. And of course, this is probably the most complex thing when doing this kind of HR or employee analytics, is because you constantly have employees coming and going from the company. So, if somebody asks how many employees there are or how many employees have left the company, the first question you have to ask is like, well, when are we talking about? Are we talking about today? Are we talking about a few months ago? Headcounts at companies are constantly shifting and changing. So before we start worrying about any of the actual DAX or calculations, let's go ahead and add another data set to our data model here. I'm going to go up here. I'm going to add an Excel workbook. And let's go ahead and head over to this Udemy class, open up our HR folder, and let's go ahead and bring in a date table. And in this case, I'm going to use a big date table that honestly has way more dates than we're going to need. It goes all the way back to 1914, but that's fine. We're going to go ahead and filter that as we go. I'm going to get rid of big from our date table and just call this date. And let's go ahead and bring in that date table. There we go. And now let's go ahead and add a filter to this date table, because once again, if we look over here at our date table, it has way more dates than I need. It goes all the way from 1914, I believe, all the way to 2023. So let's go ahead and filter this to just the relevant time frame that we're interested in. And that is basically going to be, we're just going to be looking at when employees are being hired. So we're going, obviously if there are no employees in a given time period, we're not interested in keeping those years. So let's go ahead and add a filter column here. We're going to call this time frame. And what we're interested in here is if the given date in our date table is greater than or equal to the first hire date in our fact table, then we definitely want to include that that time period. Likewise, if the given date is less than, and let's just use today, we also want to include that. And so we will use that to filter our date table, and I'm just going to go ahead and grab year from my date table and drag it out here so that we can make sure it's working. When we're done, we should be able to filter. And in fact, I'm going to go ahead and just add this time frame to all pages. And since our time frame basically is filtering between the first hire date in our data set and today, I would expect when I add a filter for time frame equals 1 to just see 2012 through 2023. And that is what I get. So I'm going to go ahead and just keep this time frame filter over here. Now, you might be wondering, well, Sean, since we, have our date table, obviously we're going to need to create, some kind of relationship between our date table and our data set, right? So, maybe we're going to be joining our date table based on hire date or term date, right? However, in this specific case study with HR data, this might be a surprising thing to you. We're actually not going to be joining any of our HR data to this date table. We're just going to be referencing this date table within the context of our DAX. And the reason is that we kind of want to allow there to be some, ambiguity between how our data model processes these dates, because our turnover metric and our retention metric and even our headcount metric are all going to reference this date table in subtly different ways. So we're not actually going to create any kind of relationship between our date table and our HR data model. And of course, that means when we drop all employees into this placeholder table that we've created here, you can see that I have the same headcount or the same number of employees for all years. Well, we know that's not the case. Obviously, in this more than a decade of years in our time frame, presumably we're going to start with a smaller number of employees, and then we're going to be adding and losing employees over time. And that is what our headcount measure is going to reflect. So let's go ahead and start building out our headcount measure. And we are going to use this all employees measure as kind of the template for all of the other measures that we're going to create. So we're going to create a headcount measure here. And for this measure, we're going to calculate all employees, which of course is just a count of all of the employee IDs in our data set. And we're going to filter our fact table that contains our employee IDs and our hire dates and our term dates. And we're going to start with making sure that we're filtering based on hire date being less than the last date in our date table. And I'm just going to start with this. In other words, I'm not going to complete this headcount measure yet. I'm going to start with just making sure that we're counting all employees who have a hire date that is less than the last date over here. And of course, we're looking at years here from our date table. So essentially what my headcount is doing right now is it's looking for all employees that have a hire date less than December 31st, 2012, then December 31st, 2013, then December 31st, 2014, and so on and so forth. So I'm not removing employees that are leaving the company yet. I'm just constantly adding employees in the year that they're hired, and also including any employees hired before the end of the given year. So I would expect this headcount measure as I have it right now to just be constantly increasing. And if we add this over here, you'll see that that is exactly the case. You can see that in 2012, I had 419 employees by the end of 2012, my first year of hiring. By the end of 2013, I had 800 employees, then 1,208, so on and so forth, until eventually it looks like my data set must stop in 2021 or 2022. This is a somewhat outdated data set, so it's fine, but you can see that eventually I do hit a wall where I'm just sustaining 4,138 employees. I'm not actually adding any new employees in those time frames. While I'm here, I'm also going to go ahead and just click on my headcount measure, format it to include commas. Now that we've done that, let's go ahead and jump back into our measure and let's make an allowance for term dates. And in this case, we're going to be eliminating any employees who have a term date that is greater than the last date of our date column. And what this is going to do is it's going to start removing some of the employees who are being terminated. And you're going to immediately realize, well, Sean, this really messed up the headcount. Look how small these numbers are. And we're not actually wrong yet, because what we're doing is now we're adding criteria for eliminating employees with term dates. And that's going to immediately make our headcount super small because now we're effectively only counting employees who have term dates. If we go back over to our data set, of course, we'll notice most employees don't have term dates. And that is what a company would hope to see. Obviously, companies don't want to constantly be losing their employees. They're trying to retain employees, especially if they're good ones. So right now, we're adding a criteria that is filtering our entire formula based on the criteria that that an employee has a term date. So we need to do one more thing here, and that is we need to make an allowance for all of our employees who have no term date, or in other words, where the term date value is blank for them. When we do that, we add our employees who are still with the company back into the data set. So you'll notice that now our head count is no longer 4,138. It is 3,409, which in other words is the number of employees that we have right now, or at the very least at the point of the last date or period in our data set. So now our head count is excluding employees who have left the company. And if you will remember, in 2012, this number was 419. So let's go ahead and test that out and make sure that our head count is working correctly. So first, I'm going to go ahead and just go up here, and let's go ahead and add a date slider. And let's go ahead and restrict our time period here to just 2012, just 2012 hires. And you can see my all employees head measure up here is now 419. This is saying 409. So what we're expecting to see is that we have effectively lost 10 employees that we hired in 2012 by the end of 2012. So in other words, we must have had 10 of these 419 employees hired in 2012 leave in the same year. So let's go ahead and head over to our data view, and let's filter our term date to just look at people who left in 2012. And when we apply that, you can see there are 10 employees who were hired in 2012 who also left in 2012. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So it does look like our headcount measure is doing exactly what we would hope for it to do. So now we've got our headcount measure locked in. Now that we have our headcount measure, we're going to start calculating one of the most important HR employee measures that we can calculate, and that is employee retention, which is not to be confused with a couple of other kind of similar in nature measures such as employee turnover and employee attrition. We are going to be calculating turnover here in just a moment. We're not going to be dealing with attrition in this series because the data set doesn't really lend itself to attrition. But we are going to calculate employee retention, which is basically just for any given time period, how many of the employees that we started with were we able to retain at the end of a given time period. So let me go ahead and just write down that formula so that we can reference it. I'm just going to go ahead and put this down here at the bottom. Employee retention we're going to be focused on the number of employees we started with, and from that, the number of the same employees we ended with. And then from there, it's just simple division. So let me go ahead and make this a little bit larger so that we can easily reference it. And I really want to put special emphasis on this part. We're always looking at the number of employees that we started with. And of those employees, only the employees that we started with, we're interested in tracking the number of employees that we were able to retain. So we're not interested in really evaluating the employees that we picked up or new hires throughout that time period, because those are net new employees. Those don't count towards retention because we didn't retain them. We picked them up in the course of time, right? We're only looking at the number of employees that we started with in a given time period, and then of those employees, how many were we able to retain? So let's go ahead and start with just the employees that we were able to hire in 2012. So let me go ahead and turn this from a vertical list into a between slider, and let's go ahead and turn off the super annoying responsive setting, and let's go ahead and just filter down our employees until we're just looking at 2012. And you can see, of course, over here in our head count that we hired 419 people in 2012, and we ended 2012 with only 409 employees because we actually lost some employees along the way. Now, if you will remember my employee retention formula down here, it's the number of employees that we started with, and from that we're dividing the number of employees that we ended with. So we can't actually calculate employee retention for 2012 because technically we started 2012 with 0 employees, no employees. This data set starts in 2012, and so our first hire is somewhere in early 2012, and then we're just picking up employees throughout the year until we've picked up 419. And then if you'll recall over here, we have term dates starting in November of 2012. So that's when we started losing some employees. So first, let's go ahead and add a very similar table over here. Let's start with just year. Let's make sure that we are not summarizing it. I'm going to go ahead and just borrow the formatting from this table. There we go. And the first measure that we're going to create for our retention is actually going to be the denominator. It's the number of employees that we started with. So let's go ahead and create a new measure, and I'm going to call this starting headcount. And it is going to look something like this. We're going to be calculating a new measure based on all employees. We're going to be using our fact table, of course, and this is going to look very similar in nature to our headcount measure. It's going to have a lot of the same components, but we're just going to kind of mix them up a little bit. So just like with our headcount, we're going to be looking for situations where the hire date is less than the first date of whatever time period we're looking at. In this case, we're looking at years, so it's going to be, we're looking for people who were hired before January 1st, 2012, January 1st, 2013, January 1st, 2014, and we're also going to be looking for people where the term date is blank, of course, because we don't want to accidentally eliminate employees who are still with the company. So we want to make sure that we're always making sure that we're adding employees with no term date back into our measure, but we want to make sure that we're always eliminating employees who have term dates on or after the first date in our date table. In other words, we want to count all employees on the first date of each year, even if they were terminated at some point during the year. We need to get rid of them, because we're calculating retention here. But we want to make sure that we're counting them on the very first date so that we know exactly how many employees we're starting each year with. And you will notice here that 2012 immediately disappears. So let's go ahead and add 2012 back in by, all I did was I just clicked on the little caret here for year, clicked show items with no data, and you'll notice that 2012 is blank. And really, the way that this measure evaluates 2012 is 0 because we have no employees with hire dates that are less than January 1st, 2012, or the first date in 2012. Our hire dates start in 2012. So this is why we can't calculate retention for 2012, because we started that year with 0 employees, and then from there we started hiring. So you'll notice here, and when coming into 2013, I have 409 as my starting headcount, and that corresponds exactly with the ending headcount for 2012. So that's how I know that I'm on the right track. And again, for now, we're just looking at employees that were hired in 2012. I'm excluding everyone else. And you're going to notice here that my headcount, my starting headcount is constantly decreasing because basically I'm just looking at the employees that I hired in 2012, and I'm looking at how many of those employees are persisting throughout later years. And so you can see that I entered 2013 with 409 of the people that I hired in 2012. I must have had more employees leave in 2013, so I'm starting 2014 with only 380. Then it looks like I had about 30 more employees leave in 2014, so I'm starting 2015 with 353 employees. And then it kind of stabilizes out, and it looks like in the later years, I'm not losing any more of my 2012 hires. They're still with the company. So I've already got half of my retention formula. I've already got the denominator, and that is how many employees I'm starting with. Now I need to calculate my ending headcount. And my ending headcount is also going to be very, very similar. I'm going to calculate all employees, and I'm going to filter my fact table to show people with hire dates that are less than the first date being evaluated for any given time period. And of course, I want to make sure that I am always keeping my employees with no term date. And I'm going to exclude from my ending headcount any employees that were eliminated within the course of the year. So I'm going to specify that I want to filter anyone with term dates greater than or equal than the last date in any given time period that I'm evaluating here. So when I drop my ending headcount in here, you'll notice that I basically end up with the starting headcount for the following year, which makes perfect sense, right? I started 2013 with 409 employees. Throughout the year, throughout 2013, of those 409 employees, I only had 380 left on the last day of 2013. That means that this number then becomes the number that I start the following year with. I ended 2013 with 380 employees. I start 2014 with 300 employees. Throughout the year, I lose about another 30 employees. And I end 2014 with 353 employees, which means I start 2015 with 353 employees. So now that we have both of the measures that we need, we can actually write our retention measure. And this is just going to be simple division, and we're going to divide our ending headcount by our starting headcount. And let's go ahead and add this in. This is going to be a percentage, of course, and I only need one decimal place. And you can see that my retention of my 2012 hires in 2013 was 92%, actually closer to 93%. It was the same in 2014, then 99%, 98%, 99%, 100%. So we're just looking at 2012 hires right now. Now let's go ahead and remove our restriction and go ahead and open this up. And the first thing that you might notice with our retention calculation is that the 380 that we ended 2013 with no longer matches the number that we're starting 2014 with. And you can see that these numbers no longer correspond to the next row. So what's going on here? Is our retention calculation screwed up? No, it isn't. What's happening now is we're counting new hires that were hired throughout these years. Now, of course, remember our formula. Retention is of the number of employees that we started the time period with, how many of those employees were we able to retain at the end of the time period? So anybody that we hired in 2013 doesn't get counted towards the retention measure for 2013. We're just looking at the number of employees that we had on January 1st, 2013 and trying to estimate how many of those employees we retained at the end of 2013. The reason that we're starting 2014 with 757 employees is it just means that we hired several hundred employees throughout 2013. And guess what? Those employees, if they're still present on January 1st, 2014, we're now ready to count them in our retention formula. So they do get counted here. And then it's the same for subsequent years. The reason that these numbers start to diverge from the ending headcount is because every time we start a new time period, we want to count or take a snapshot of all employees who are present on that date. So now all of the employees that we hire in the previous year, they get counted on January 1st of the next year towards the retention formula. So that's our retention formula. Let's go ahead and quickly clean up our starting headcount and ending headcount by adding commas where appropriate. And there we go. So now we've got our retention formula. Let's go ahead and get ready for turnover. So calculating turnover is going to be a lot easier now that we've already set up measures like headcount and retention, because we really already have all of the ingredients for turnover already over here in our existing measures. So before I calculate turnover, I just want to make a couple of observations here, and that is that in my research, turnover tends to be a little bit more nuanced in how different companies calculate it. I know that I did some research before this video, and I see several different ways of calculating turnover, but they do all basically boil down to taking the number of employees that have left the company in a given time frame divided by the average number of employees within the company in that given time. And it's the average number of employees in the denominator that I'm seeing quite a few different ways of calculating it online. One of my old employers used to just take the ending number of employees at the end of a year. I see some companies that it looks like they kind of do an average based on the average number of employees per month in a given time frame. So for example, if you're looking to calculate annual turnover, they basically look at the average number of employees for each month in that given year. I also see online a somewhat simpler way of calculating it, which is for any given time period, just taking the starting number of employees and the ending number of employees, and then dividing those two numbers by 2, and then from that, dividing the number of employees that left the company. So we're going to go with that definition for this calculation just because it is really easy to calculate that with what we've already got. So let me just go ahead and define that as, I'm going to go ahead and just grab some text here to change up my font. There we go. So for employee turnover, we're basically going to do a count of employees who left the company divided by the starting number of employees plus ending number of employees divided by 2. Now, I do want to make sure that I'm clear here that with the starting number of employees and the ending number of employees, we can use the starting number of employees from our retention. That's totally fine. But the ending number of employees that I'm talking about here is the ending number of employees at the company in that given time period, regardless of when they were hired. So we're not talking about the same number of employees that we ended with in our retention formula, where the employees that we were left with were derived from the employees that we started the time period with. That's retention. For our ending number of employees, we're talking about the total number of employees regardless of when they were hired at the end of the time interval. So effectively, what we're really talking about here is we're talking about our headcount measure. So in order to get turnover for 2013, we're basically talking about the 409 employees that we started with in 2013, and we ended 2019 with 757. So we're going to be taking the average of those two numbers. So let's go ahead and create a new measure here, and we're going to call this just average number of employees. And we're going to be using, again, starting headcount plus just our headcount measure. And we're going to be dividing that by 2. And let's go ahead and create yet another version of this table. And let's go ahead and add our starting head count and our head count. And I'm going to go ahead and just get rid of this since I'm running out of room. And you can see that our average number of employees here is 583 for 2013, 929 for 2014. You can see that we're just taking the average of our starting and ending headcounts for the year. So in order to get at turnover, all we need is simply to divide the number of employees who left the company, which means that actually I need to calculate that first. So let's create a measure here called departing employees. Just to keep things as simple as possible, I'm going to create a separate measure for this. We're going to calculate this as all employees. And of course, we're going to use similar logic that we've been using so far, people fact. And here we're looking for anyone who had a term date between the first date in whatever time interval we're looking at and a term date before the last date in whatever time period we're looking at. And this makes sense, right? To calculate the departing employees, we're just looking at anyone who in the course of whatever time period we're looking at left the company somewhere in 2013 or 2014 or 2015. So our departing employees are 10 for 2012, which you'll absolutely remember is right, correct? Because we already did this test when we first started looking at headcount, where we filtered just for any employees with a term date in 2012. And you'll remember we had 10 employees. You can count them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. That matches to the 10 departing employees in 2012. Looks like we had 33 people leave in 2013, 63 in 2014, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to go ahead and just give myself a little bit more room here to continue with the last piece of our turnover calculation. And so our turnover calculation, and you can call this a rate or a percent, is going to be our departing employees. And we're going to divide that by our average number of employees to get our turnover rate, which you can see for almost any given year, ranges between, looks like we've got some lows in 2019 and 2020 of about 2 to 3%, and highs in 2013 and 2014% of 2014 of 7%, which is pretty well on track with most turnover calculations. Now, that I've ever calculated. I've not often seen much higher turnover rates than this. So, this kind of feels accurate based on the data that I've got. And you'll notice down here that some of the totals look really wonky. That's no problem. We'll be able to resolve this as we start building our report. But for now, at least on a year-by-year basis, we're able to calculate all of the measures that we need, including our big three: headcount, retention, and turnover.